Mi yamalel gvurot Yisrael otan miyimne, hein bechol dor yakum hagibor goel ha'am. Who can retell the glories of the people Israel? Who can count them? Hein bechol dor, in every generation, yakum hagibor, there rises a hero to rescue this nation. If you want to understand Harold Schulweiss's theology, you have to understand that there's a quality of the heroic about it. There's something heroic about this. Not just because we love the man and he was inspiring to so many of us, but there was a mission that he set himself on. And it was a mission precisely that, Goel Ha'am, to rescue a people. It was a mission that I think that he gained from his teacher Mordechai Kaplan, and before that gained from the community in which he grew up. Like Mordechai Kaplan, he perceived that his community was in danger. It was threatened. And the threat consisted specifically of a loss of faith, of a loss of confidence in its own narratives, its own story, its own ideology, in a loss of affection for the symbols and the rituals and the rites and the traditions that had formed the core of this people. Start with the most obvious facts about his life. The rabbi is a theologian, and the theologian is a rabbi. The rabbi is a theologian, which is to say that the problem that he is going to attack is not just going to be how to get more Jews keeping more kosher or more Jews keeping more Shabbos. That the problem of the Jewish people is not simply the abandonment of ritual life or the abandonment of Jewish institutions or lower levels of membership and affiliation or lower levels of giving. Deep at the heart of all of those problems is a singular issue. Jews don't believe what Jews once believed. Jews don't believe what Jews once believed. And when they come to the synagogue, they can't open the prayer book and recite the prayers because they don't believe in the God that is spoken about in the prayer book. And when they come to Hebrew school, they can't learn the things that kids used to learn in Cheder because we simply don't believe those narratives anymore. And until Jews are given something that they can believe in, some version, some interpretation of Judaism that is morally and personally compelling, you're not going to solve this problem. You're not going to get people to come to shul with nicer melodies or with better translations of the prayer book or with better food at the Kiddush if the prayers they recite don't make sense to them. The rabbi is a theologian because he perceives that the problem in front of him is to recreate, use the word, reconstruct Jewish belief. Kaplan saw the same thing. In 1923, Kaplan was a rabbi, a young rabbi in Upper West Side of Manhattan. He served for 10 years in a pulpit. And one Passover, he was giving a Yontif sermon, 1932. He's giving a Yontif sermon, Pesach, and he's talking about the Passover story. And in the middle of the sermon, the rabbi stops. Rabbi Kaplan stopped. And he asked himself a question, which no rabbi should ever ask himself while he's preaching a sermon. He said to himself, "Do you believe this? You who have a PhD from Columbia University? You who have studied sciences? Do you believe in rivers that turn into blood and frogs that rise spontaneously from the ground? And you believe in seas that split and snakes that talk? Do you believe in any of this stuff?" And for a long time, the rabbi stood silent at that pulpit until the cantor said, "Would you like me to finish the service, Rabbi?" And he said, "Yeah." Kaplan sat down. And as soon as Yontif was over, he resigned the pulpit because he came to the conclusion that he couldn't preach what they wanted him to preach. And he gave up the rabbinate, became a salesman for the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, at which he was a dismal failure. Because if you can't sell theology, you can't sell insurance either. And then he was called back to the seminary by Solomon Schechter to become a teacher at the seminary. And there Kaplan began to reconstruct Judaism. For Mordechai Kaplan, the problem was How do I believe in what the Torah tells me to believe in? How do I believe in what the tradition says I'm to believe in if I know science? If I know sciences, how do I observe these stories of miracles? If I know science, how do I teach this stuff? And so Kaplan begins to create a new Judaism within the realm of what we know is true. By the time his student, Harold Schulweis, arrives at JTS in 1945, the problem had changed. It was no longer a question of I'm not able to believe in what the Torah teaches me to believe in because I know sciences. It now is a moral question. What does it do to me as a moral human being to recite these words and recite these prayers? The rabbi is a theologian because he understands that the problem in front of us is a problem of what Jews can believe in. The theologian is a rabbi. The theologian is a rabbi, which is unusual, you know, because at a certain point, somewhere in the 18th century, philosophy and theology became the domain of college professors. And college professors live in a certain world. God bless college professors, but they live in a certain world. Rabbis live in a very different world. In a very different world. I was at a funeral service this morning. I had one yesterday. I have another one tomorrow. Rabbis live in a world in which where a rabbi is confronted with human suffering on a day-to-day basis. Rabbis live in a world in which people struggle with faith not because science teaches them that they can't believe in miracles, but because they ask the question, why me? Why us? Why did this happen? In one of the most arresting articles that Rabbi Schulweis ever wrote, he told a story which is a true story, unfortunately, but a very arresting story. It was a kid who went to synagogue on Yom Kippur with his family and told his father that he was invited to a breakfast, wanted to leave shul early so he could get to the breakfast just as Yom Kippur was over. And the father said, stay with us, stay in the shul till after Nila, and then you can go to the breakfast. So he stayed in shul till after Nila, after it got dark, and then he drove to the breakfast, and because the roads were dark and he was tired, he drove off the road, or he was hit by a drunk driver. The kid was killed in the car. Rabbi Schulweis got the call during the breakfast and ran to that family's home and entered the home, and the father of the young man was in the young man's bedroom. And Rabbi Schulweis went to sit with the man and hold his hand, and the man exploded and screamed at the rabbi. He stayed in shul until Nila. How could this happen to him? Why would your God let this happen to him? And the rabbi sat and absorbed this man's rage and his pain and his suffering for some minutes and minutes and minutes and minutes. And then he went to meet the wife, and the wife was embarrassed at the husband's explosion and said, Rabbi, don't take it personally. And Rabbi Schulweis wrote in his reflection, he said, how can I not take it personally? How can I not take it personally? This is what I do. I answer that question. What am I supposed to answer him? What am I supposed to answer him? Am I supposed to suddenly say, we can't know why these things happen? After all that preaching, all that writing, all these words, suddenly I'm an agnostic. When this man needs an answer, I'm an agnostic? Am I supposed to say that there's something good in this? That a decent, loving, good God did this because there's some good outcome? Am I supposed to deny the man's rage and his pain and tell him that there's some good side to this? How can I not take this personally? The rabbi is a theologian because he understands that at the heart of the modern problem is our lack of belief. And the theologian is a rabbi, so that this theology is going to be challenged at every corner by that question. There are lots of questions that theologians raise. How do you know there's a God? How do you know the Torah is true? Does God listen to prayer? Is halacha valid anymore? Does it have any authority? All of the questions that Rabbi Farkas and I learned when we were in seminary philosophy classes. But for a rabbi who lives that life and does that work, there's only one question. How did God let this happen to me, to my family, to my loved one, to my child? And that question, that becomes the obstacle. Who is the audience for whom Harold Schulweis writes? He doesn't write academic articles. I counted 250 articles on my bibliography. 2 of them I would count as academic. One of them on Karl Barth, and one of them on Charles Hartshorne. Don't worry about who those people are. The other 248 articles are for you. The name of the book that he wrote is For Those Who Can't Believe. That's an interesting title. I've meditated on that title a long time. Harold Schulweis had no patience with lazy Jews. He once gave a beautiful sermon. He said, you come to me and you tell me that you're a gastronomic Jew, right? Do you eat like my uncles? Do you eat like my aunts? Do you know what pierogi are? Do you know what latkes are? Do you know what borscht is? Do you know what shav is? You're not even a good gastronomical Jew. You're a half-assed Jew no matter how you cut it. He's not interested in those Jews. He's interested in Jews who have confronted their faith and tradition and have found it wanting because it doesn't answer the fundamental question. How do you live in a world filled with so much suffering? Where is the order in that world? That's where his theology begins. It's not for those who won't believe. It's for those who can't believe. And for those who can't believe, here is a rabbi who heroically is going to try to reconstruct, recreate a way of believing. And that's going to be his theological task. The rabbi is a theologian, and the theologian is a rabbi. Now, in 1993, the journal Shema asked a group of its contributing writers to write short sections, about a 400-word essay called I Believe. And I think it answers the questions we've come to ask tonight. So I gave you a copy. Did everybody have a copy? So you can take a look. I thought we'd go through this as an outline today and try to understand what he meant by this and unpack some of these statements. If you don't have it, just share with someone who's nice and warm and friendly. This is a good way to build community, which is another Schulweisian move, right? They asked him, what do you believe in? Seems like the sort of thing that any rabbi would be glad to speak about for hours and hours and hours. He starts with a cautionary word, which is in some ways really unlike him. But I think that what he was worried about was making it too, what he called apodictic, which making it too simple. The tragic record of intolerance in God's name against those who cannot or will not believe or practice as we do, the documentation of cruelty by those who raise the sacralized word, the sacred word, to savage the lives of those who fall outside the circle of our definition. The history of religious beliefs baptized in the threatening waters of absolutism are reasons enough to temper the apodictic declaration of belief. Don't be intimidated by that. What? You have that right here? I believe, right at the top. Yes, that's one sentence, by the way. Okay, now Malka's here, and she was an English teacher for many years. Yeah, I know you did, but you should have told him to break that into 4 sentences. What's he worried about? He's worried about once you put down, here are the 10 things I believe in, or the 13 things you have to believe in, then you can use that as a weapon of exclusion. Unfortunately, our world is suffering from this right now, of people who have drawn a line and said, you either believe like us or we destroy you. And he didn't want to see that neither in the Jewish community nor in the world community of faiths. So he says, before I give you my answer, understand that there needs to be a certain humility in this process. I offer you my answer, but I want you to understand that my answer to what I believe in is, first of all, tentative. It's what I believe in now. Tomorrow I may change my mind. And second of all, I have enough humility to know that what I believe in may not be what you believe in. There's no single truth that I'm going to fight for and destroy you over. So let's just be careful about that. Let's just be careful about that. So now let's take to the next paragraph. Ready? With that self-admonitory caution in mind, I believe with Franz Rosenzweig that truth is a noun only for God. For us, it is an adverb. Translation: I know nothing of God as a noun. I know from the collective experiences of my people recorded in sacred texts and from my own experiences only the gerunds. Remember what gerunds are? Those are words that end in ing, right? helping, eating, swimming, breathing, gerunds, okay? Only I'll talk about what that means in a minute, the gerunds of God. Healing the sick, clothing the naked, housing the homeless, pursuing peace, loving my people and my neighbors. I am bound to testify to the verbs of God by the adverbs of my conduct. God is behaved. This is what Rabbi Schulweis called predicate theology. Let me define that for you briefly. When you ask the question that we asked a moment ago, the question that that poor grieving father was asking the rabbi in that moment of terrible pain, why me? Why us? Why my child? Why did this happen? Philosophers call that the problem of evil. Why do bad things happen to good people? Rabbi Schulweis takes that problem with utter seriousness. And he says to us, look, when you think about that question, what are you saying? You're saying, I was taught to believe in a God who governs the world, a God who is good, a God who is powerful, a God who is knowing. But if there is a God who is good and a God who is powerful and a God who is knowing, then bad things should not happen to good people. Sweet young children who go home after shul should not get hurt in car accidents. This shouldn't happen in the world. If it happens in the world, it's one of two things. Either God isn't good, God isn't powerful, or God isn't knowing, in which we'd say God isn't good, God lets bad things happen, or God isn't powerful, God can't do anything about it anyway, or God didn't know about it, or God let it happen. And if God let it happen, was it because it's a good thing, not an evil thing? But it looks like an evil thing. It hurts me like an evil thing. That problem is unsolvable, says the rabbi. You can go around and around and around. You will not be able to solve that problem. And so the rabbi says, that, by the way, is for any individual evil, much less for a gargantuan radical evil like the Holocaust. He says the problem there is, and then what happens typically, by the way, what happens is as soon as you ask the question, those who believe try to defend God. Well, you have to understand that what's good for us is not what's good for God. Or that God has his reasons for doing these things. Which, if you think about those for just a moment or two, are even more frustrating than what you just said. You mean God kills children? And that's supposed to be good? And I'm supposed to worship such a God? There is no way to answer that question, says the rabbi. And therefore, he says, there is no way to believe in that God anymore. Simply no way to believe in that God anymore. So what does one do? So the rabbi says, well, do we give it up altogether, or is there something else there? And here's what he suggests to us. I asked him once where he got this idea, because there's a very famous philosopher named Feuerbach, a German philosopher of the 19th century, who offered a similar idea. And he said, no, I didn't get it from Feuerbach. I got it from saying brachot. When we say a bracha, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Think about the bracha for a minute. Blessed are you, Lord, ruler of the universe, who brings bread out of the earth. Why do you need the end of the bracha? Wouldn't it be just enough to say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam? Good nog, done. Blessed is God. What's this hamotzi lechem min haaretz business? What do you think that God is only blessed because it's hamotzi lechem min haaretz? You should just bless God because God is God. But we go on to say hamotzi lechem min haaretz, not just hamotzi lechem min haaretz. We Jews, we have 500 of these. There are 500 brachot. You're supposed to say 100 a day. How many of you are up to now? You have a little bit of time. You're supposed to, there you go. You're supposed to say 100. Now think about that. Why do we append the words hamotzi lechem min haaretz to the blessing of God instead of just saying bless God? And the answer is because the tradition wasn't concerned only with blessing God. It was blessing what God does. It is the actions of God, what we call the attributes of God, the connection of God with the world. It's the predicate of the sentence, not the subject. And what Rabbi Schulweis argued is that in Jewish tradition, if you look at the tradition, what the rabbis particularly were interested in was not describing who is God, what is God like. In fact, Maimonides and the other philosophers said you can't say anything about God. God is infinite. You have no language to describe that which is infinite. But what you can describe is what God does. What Maimonides called providence, how God relates to the world. What God does is a lot more interesting to us than who God is. The predicate of the sentence is a lot more interesting than the subject of the sentence. And if that's the case, then what if we take the theology and turn it upside down? Instead of worshiping that God who we can't understand, what if we say, let's put that aside, bracket it out, not pay attention to it as fervently, and look instead at what it is that God does and what it is in the world that we would define as godly. He did this exercise with a high school class. He wrote on the blackboard these sentences: God heals the sick. God makes peace. God feeds the hungry. Then he wrote on the blackboard, healing the sick is godly. Making peace is godly. Feeding the hungry is godly. And he asked the kids in the confirmation class, how many of you believe in this? And none of the kids raised their hand. And they had all kinds of reasons why they can't. Because they said, look, if you said God heals the sick, then how come there's sick people in the world? And if God feeds the hungry, then why are there hungry people in the world? And then he looked at this and said, feeding the sick, feeding the hungry, and healing the sick is godly. And every kid said, of course I can agree with that. And that's the point. That the predicates of divinity, that is, the descriptions of what is godly in life, make a lot more sense to us as modern people than having to defend the subject. And he said, let that be our religion. Let that be our religion. Let it be an embracing of that which our community over the centuries has discovered is godly. Let me give you a slightly different way to understand this, something I spoke about on the High Holidays. There was a wonderful philosopher of legal theory named Robert Cover, who once wrote that the values of a legal system are always based in narrative. That every legal community, every democratic community has a narrative, has a story, and out of the story that we hold together, our common set of beliefs about what democracy is, what society is, what are the rights of individuals, we draw values, we draw norms that govern our society. It seems to me that what modernity is a time when the narratives no longer work, even though we might still have the values. Translation: why do I object to a traditional belief about God? Because I'm sickened by the fact that there's such war in the world. There's such hunger in the world. There's such disease in the world. That is, it is a very religiously legitimate reason not to believe in God. That father who said to the rabbi, "Why me?" was asking a very holy question. The child's destruction sickens us. And so we ask the question, how can I believe in a God who would allow that? The question itself is a holy question. That is, we become atheists for really good religious reasons. So the rabbi simply turns it upside down and says, if we have these norms and values, let's take the norms and values that we have and build a new narrative. And the new narrative is that our people has discovered ways in which to live, which give life value, and we call these things godly. And the pursuit of religion is not the worship of a God up there. Either there is no God up there, or if there isn't much you're going to say about him, her. On the other hand, religion is about teaching us the ways of that God and pursuing those ways in life. And that's what he called godliness, or predicate theology. I would add one more point to this, which he didn't add, but it's my gloss on him. So the question people asked him was, what's the difference between saying something is good and something is godly? Why use the language of God altogether? Why not just call yourself a secular humanist and say that feeding the hungry is good, that housing the homeless is good, that making peace is good. Why use this language of godliness altogether? And in his book, Evil and the Morality of God, he says there's 3 reasons. 1 is because nobody can tell me what God is, so I'm going to decide for myself. 2 is because it connects me with my ancestors who were seeking the ways of godliness. And 3, because it raises from everyday ordinary ethics some particular imperative to make it sacred. I want to go one step further, click on that last one. I'm going to tell you, and I think he believed this because he acted this way, even though he may not have preached it, that when you say something is godly, it becomes imperative, uncompromisingly commanded to you. You got to do it. I can say to you, driving 35 miles an hour down Ventura Boulevard is good. But if I have a chance to go 45, I'm going to go 45. Because good can be compromised. But once I say something is godly, it means I stake myself on it. It means I stake myself on it. And therefore, it becomes an uncompromised imperative. Something I'm going to do no matter what. No matter what. Janice is here, who worked with the rabbi in developing Jewish World Watch. The rabbi believed that we Jews maintain a godly sense of responsibility to end genocide in the world, which means that even though we have very little in common with Africans in Darfur, this became his obsession for the last 10 years of his life. This becomes his obsession because you can't turn away from it, because you can't compromise it, because you can't say that I have other things that I'm busy with, because you can't say that it's not my problem anymore. Once you call it godly, it becomes an uncompromised imperative. So go back over the statement that he wrote. I know nothing of God as a noun. I know nobody up there. Either there is nobody up there, but if there is somebody up there, I can't know him anyway. Maimonides argued that in the 12th century. I only know from the collective experiences of my people recorded in sacred texts and from my own experiences the gerunds of God, healing the sick, clothing the naked, housing the homeless, pursuing peace, loving my people and my neighbors. This is what makes for life, a life that's meaningful, and these are the uncompromised imperatives of our tradition. Why do you come to shul? For a really simple reason. Because everything in your life has compromises. Because you're always driving faster than 35. Because you're always cutting corners in business. Because you're always making compromises in the daily life. There's very few things in life which are uncompromised and purely imperative. And coming to shul, you touch those. And in touching those, you touch a sacred energy inside of all of us. That's what this faith is. That's what makes something godly. I am bound to testify to the verbs of God by the adverbs of my conduct. God is behaved. Which means if you tell me you're an atheist, that's irrelevant to me. I want to know what you care about. I want to know what is the uncompromised imperative that drives your life. And if I see that you're a person who is uncompromisingly obsessed with protecting justice in the world, I'm going to tell you, despite yourself, that you're a believer. Because you live a godly life. In other words, the great question to me isn't, do you believe in God? The great question is, what difference does it make? If I watched your life, what difference does it make? The arguments for God's existence and goodness, I'm back in the text, are not furnished by inductive or deductive logic. I'm not going to prove to you that there's a God. I'm not going to demonstrate to you that there's a God. I'm not going to organize an experience where all of us are going to suddenly see, feel, or hear God. The evidence is in our mouths, hands, and feet, individually and collectively. We are the verifiers of God's reality. There's a midrash. And the midrash is that God, it's in the book of Isaiah that God says, you are my witnesses and I am God. And the midrash offers, the rabbis of the midrash take that line and say, if you are my witnesses, then I am God. And if you're not, then I'm not God. That is, God enters the world only through the actions of people. Now, put that individually. Each of us has the capacity to act beyond the interests and needs of ourselves. We all have needs. We all have interests. We all have impulses. We all have reflexes. We all have desires. And we can pursue those desires. In fact, 'tis the season for pursuing desires. The malls are filled with people buying stuff so that they can pursue their desires. But every now and again, we do something beyond my own interests, beyond my desires. And in doing so, I discover a capacity of myself. Heschel wrote about this. He defined this as what a mitzvah is, a selfless act by which I come to discover the capacity of myself. The selfless act by which I discover the capacities of the self. Rabbi Shul, I once went to see him in a hospital, and one of the many times he was in a hospital. And he says to me, "Do you know who was here this morning?" And I said, "No, who came this morning?" He said, "The doctor." I said, "Well, that makes sense." He said, No. He came at 5:30 in the morning. I said, "Well, they have to, because they have to see you in the morning, because then they go to their office or their clinic. And he's coming back 7:30 tonight." He said, "Remind me never to make people feel bad that they don't come to shul." He said, no, he's very serious about this. He says, I feel terrible. I yell at these guys about not coming to shul. This poor guy was here 5:30 in the morning doing rounds of his patients in a hospital. Then he does a whole day of clinic, and then he comes back at 7:30 in the evening, and I'm going to make the guy feel bad he doesn't come to shul? Nebuch. I said, "Well, why do you think he does that?" He said, "That's a good question." The selfless act is how you come to discover the true capacities of self, and how you discover the sacred within you, and how you find a life of meaning. And that's what he's talking about. Religious beliefs are conditional. They demand our behavioral testimony, which means, what difference does it make? God is nameless, and it is blasphemous to pronounce it as if we know his essence. Now, what he's going to do now is go back and say, listen, the traditional notions of belief leave us all confounded. This is a much better way to believe. So look at the next paragraph. What does it mean that you or I believe? What does the answer tell me about you or myself? Not whether we believe or not whether we obey or not, but what kind of God we believe and what kind of imperatives we are prepared to obey reveal the meaning of our faith. Have we not been persecuted by religious believers? Have we not been protected by those who deny belief? Jeremiah sought believing behavior as evidence of God. So this is his profound contribution to the questions of theology. This notion of behaving. Now, there's one more point about this that I want to articulate, and then, I'll keep talking. And one more point I want to that I think is very important about this. Before modernity, when Jews lived traditional lives, we ascribed everything to God. Think Tevye. Right? Everything comes from God. Modernity comes and everything is lodged here in human beings. And we say, I can't believe in that God because we human beings now have the power to create for ourselves. And then after the Holocaust, you have a response to that, which we could call the postmodern response. Traditional Judaism, traditional religion, traditional culture ascribed all power and glory and truth to God. All truth was held in God. Modernity came and said, no, man, human beings doing science will discover the truth. Post-modernity came and said, if science gave us Auschwitz, then science is a curse. And people began looking for God again, for a transcendent kind of God again, and they have this tremendous sense of suspicion. This tremendous sense of suspicion about anything human. So my Orthodox cousins tell me, if you believe that human beings wrote the Torah, then what good is it? That's such an interesting question, because for my cousins, it's an either-or question. Either God wrote it and it's pure and valuable, or human beings touched it and it's polluted and corrupt. And it's got to be one or the other. And believers, I don't know how many believers you hang with, but I hang with lots of them professionally. Believers tend to split the world this way. And the rabbi comes along and says, first of all, I don't like splits. Whenever you hear an either or question in religion, ask yourself, what's the excluded middle? Either or is never a good way to think because it excludes a middle, and the truth is going to be found in that middle. And second of all, why is it necessary that if we touch it, it becomes corrupt? Why if we touch it, it becomes corrupt? Well, who said that? Why can't sensitive, caring, wise human beings debate the truth and together as a community of caring believers arrive at a collective truth that we can stand by because we're capable of something good, because we're not completely corrupt? I don't know how many of you read the Jewish Journal, but Brother Dennis Prager has a column in the Jewish Journal which has caused much consternation, where he basically says, here's what Torah says. If you disagree, you don't believe in Torah. If there ever was an either-or argument, there it is. Either it's the Torah's way of doing things, or it's a bunch of lily-livered liberals who don't know the truth. And there's no, so you write back and you say, dear Brother Dennis, the Torah according to whom? Your Torah? My Torah, the Lubavitch guy's Torah, the Reform guy's Torah? Whose Torah? It's all an interpreted Torah for one thing, but more than that, why do you mean that a community can't read Torah and decide together what it means for us? Rabbi Schulweis has a lot of confidence in the power of communities to decide truth. He had a lot of faith in us. He had a lot of faith in his congregants. He had a lot of faith in his friends. He had a lot of faith in his students. He had a lot of faith in human beings to collectively discover truth. And for him, that's what this godliness is about. It's a God who lives within, and a God that is expressed in the best of human behavior. Let's take another look. Ready? Come inside. So now the next question that the good people at the Shema magazine asked him is, the nature and content of our covenant with God. I believe that the unique character of the biblical covenant articulates the distinctive nature of Jewish theistic humanism. Theistic humanism. Theistic meaning of and having to do with God. Humanism means a belief in human beings and their capacity. And he refused to separate those two words. For him, to believe in human beings is to believe in God, and vice versa. Because the Torah, and its very beginning, says that the human being is created b'tselem Elokim, with the image of God within. The covenant runs both ways. Out one moral law in heaven as on earth. God does not exempt himself from the rules and sensibilities of the compact. The reciprocity of the Jewish covenant encouraged the human holy descent unparalleled in other theistic traditions. Now you know that his favorite Torah story was the story of Abraham's protest over Sodom and Gomorrah. You remember the story? Abraham is waiting for, Abraham circumcises himself with a sharp rock. Don't try this at home. And he's healing in the tent, and 3 angels show up in front of him, and he jumps up and serves them supper. And the first of them, he doesn't know they're angels. The first one identifies himself as an angel and says, Mazel tov, you and your wife are going to have a kid. And the wife begins to laugh because she's 90, he's 100, and Viagra is still 3,800 years away. God says, I can do miracles. I can raise the dead. You're going to have a kid. Sure enough, Isaac is born. 2 more angels are left, and the angels turn towards Sodom, and Abraham gathers that they're going to destroy the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember the story? And the Bible says, Vayigash Avraham, he steps up, and he says to God, is this really what you're going to do? Is this really what you're going to kill innocent people together with? If there are 50 innocent people in the city, you got to spare the city. And then he scolds God, Chalila lecha. Chalila lecha, which my bubby would say, Shanda necherpa. Shame on you. My bubby used to give me a zetz. She was a feh, she'd say, right? Shanda cherpa, feh, right? Like, you can't do that. You can't do that, to kill the innocent and the guilty, to erase all moral distinctions in your world between goodness and evil. And then the zinger is, Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat, shall not the judge of all the earth do justice? Now consider that story for just a minute. You all know this story. Consider that story for a minute. What does it mean for a human being to stand in front of God and argue with him? I thought God is perfect. How can you argue with God if God is perfect? How can you argue with God if God is the source of all morality? If God is the source of all morality, you can't tell God he can't do it. All you can say is, yes, sir. But Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat means what? That God has given us a moral sensibility with which we can challenge any authority, even God. And God is held accountable to that same set of morals. And therefore you can't say, as the preacher says at the funeral, we don't know why God did this, but we know God had good reasons for that. Nonsense. Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat, says Abraham. Don't give me that. I want justice in the world. And that's not justice. And what's remarkable is that in the next scene, God doesn't smash Abraham. If I were God, boom, I'd have smashed him. Who needs this pain in the neck? I was a camp counselor. I know what these pain in the neck kids are like. You don't let a kid get away with that. Question authority. It's bad for teenagers. But God's a much better camp counselor than I was. God says, okay, you're right. What does okay, you're right mean? God welcomes the challenge. Why? Because Abraham is challenging God on the grounds of the justice that they share. And God is prepared to relinquish God's prerogatives of authority in order to further the dream of a world of justice. God says, you're right. Now, for Rabbi Schulweis, that notion that God is held to the same standard of justice means that if the world seems unjust to you, you can't say, well, that's how God wants it. Which means that your outrage is holier than your belief. And that the outrage has to have precedence over a sense of acquiescence to this. That surrender, moral surrender, is the lowest thing that a human being can engage in. Dissent is a holy act. That's his. So therefore, the notion is that conscience, that the cultivation of a moral sensibility is what religion is all about. The reciprocity of the Jewish covenant, which means it's two-way, it's a conversation, encourage the human holy dissent unparalleled in other theistic traditions. So when Jihad Turk is here in January, we're going to ask him how Muslims read that story. I want to know if a Muslim teacher ever turned to God and said, shall not the judge of all the earth do justice? Remind me to ask that question, okay? While there is no biblical, because he's a brilliant man and he'll give us a good answer. While there is no biblical or rabbinic term for conscience, its status and power within the covenant are instantiated throughout the prophetic tradition and in major portions of rabbinic midrash. In moments of moral and spiritual conflict, particularly where two or more goods or rights clash, the inner witness to covenant may rise to dissent even against established law. This is one of the other differences between Rabbi Schulweis and his teacher, Rabbi Kaplan. Professor Kaplan believed that we had gone through a rupture in Jewish history called modernity, and that modern Jews are going to look at Judaism and God differently than our ancient ancestors. Rabbi Schulweis believed all this stuff was always in the tradition. It may not have been the majority voices, it may not have been articulated, but it was always there. It just needed to be exposed. How many times when we heard him speak did he say, here's a text, why didn't they teach me this text in seminary? That was one of his favorite lines, right? And so, because what he was trying to say is that there is a tradition, this humanistic theistic tradition, this tradition of dissent is in the tradition already. It's always been there. The moral drama is played out as sacred dissent against God in the name of God. Now, dissent against God in the name of God means that the moral sensibility within us is legitimate, and it enables us to relate to a God, but also to live out what God wants in the world. If you want to look for God, don't look up. Look in. If you want to look for God, don't look up, because if you look up, then you're looking for some sort of king who's going to tell you what to do, and that's not Jewish. You find the moral voice within. And if you can't find the moral voice within, which happens frequently, then turn to one another and find it in conversation, in debate, in argument, in the collective conversation of the community. Those wrong turn to God, with God as the court of last appeal. In numerous episodes recorded in the rabbinic tradition, God recognizes the voice of moral conscience as his own. God honors the moral dissent without recrimination. The role of conscience implicit in the reciprocal covenant demonstrated the condescension of God and the elevation of his human creation. What did they teach us in Hebrew school? They didn't teach us conscience. They taught us which order to, I still can't remember this, I'm glad Noah's here, which order to light the Hanukkah candles. They taught us that. But if you take this with some seriousness, then the purpose of religious education is to teach conscience, is to cultivate a sense of moral outrage, and to cultivate a sense of moral duty, and to cultivate a kind of personality. And this will end. If you believe that he did, that God lives within, then the purpose of religion is the cultivation of a personality. That doesn't mean you can abandon ritual. People got that wrong when they came to VBS. They said, oh, VBS, you don't have to be too frum, you know. Adar Ariel, they're frum, you know. VBS, no, wrong. That was wrong. We do frumkeit really well here, but we do it differently. Because you'll say the same brachot, but you'll say them differently. And you'll keep a kosher kitchen, but you'll do it for different purposes, and you'll understand the rituals that you do, because you'll understand that the purpose of these rituals is not to worship a God who's far away. The purpose of these rituals is to cultivate a certain quality of personality, a certain kind of person. And there's a whole vocabulary in Jewish life, and the rabbi spoke this vocabulary so fluently that he was never conscious of it. But all of us who listened to it became very, very conscious of it, because it was his vocabulary. Rachmanis, the sense of compassion for the world, of feeling the pain of the world. Chesed, the sense of giving, of the open-handed givingness. Chavurah, a sense of the connections among us, where we support and protect and heal each other. These were his words, but they reflect a certain quality of personality, a certain quality of personality that all of Jewish life, all of Jewish ritual, all of Jewish practice is trying to create, is trying to aim at. It's a curriculum for the cultivation of certain kinds of people who are still to this day very, very rare in the world. This week is his yahrzeit. So turn the page to the back and read with me the end. At the end of the article, they asked him about death and the end of days, which is something like he never spoke about this, ever. He once came to me and said, I'm going to give a sermon about immortality. I said, oh, finally, you know. It's the one topic you've never talked about. It was on like Pesach or Shavuos. It was a Yizkor talk. And it was about organ transplants. And I said to him, I thought you were going to talk about immortality. He said, yeah, I am. You give away your liver, you give away your kidneys, you give away your lungs, you give away your heart, and you live forever. I said, damn, you know. In a certain way, he was so much in love with life, this was never a topic that he was even interested in. Did you ever talk about it? Never. This is the only thing I could find that he ever wrote on this. And just, I'll offer this as an epitaph. Yeah? Immortality of influence, right. And Einat Tzibor Mate, the community never dies. That's as far as he ever got. That's as far as he ever got. Right? And I'll give you a hint from behind the stage. And maybe you can he actually enjoyed doing funerals because he enjoyed meeting people and hearing the stories of their loved ones. But he was profoundly uncomfortable doing funerals. Because for him, it was always about what's left to be done in life. And a funeral doesn't give you the chance to talk about that. And so he would always turn a eulogy around, and the family was always told what they got to do next. I mean, it was almost like an appeal in the shul. Like you came to say goodbye to your bubby and your zeta, and you end up owing the synagogue $100,000, you know? At least 100,000 hours of something, right? Because for him, it was always about life. This is the only thing I could ever find that he wrote on death. So just look at this with me. I believe in the wisdom of our tradition that operates a far-reaching reality principle, particularly evident in understanding of death in the afterlife. There is no denial of the sting of death. The late Orthodox philosopher Talmudist J.B. Soloveitchik characterized the tradition as abhorring death. A corpse defiles, a grave defiles. A person who's been defiled by a corpse is defiled for 7 days and is forbidden to eat any sacred offerings or enter the temple. His halachic sentiments are rooted in the strong life affirmation of Judaism. And I would say the strong life affirmation of Schulweis. The Jewish reality principle extends to the status of the deceased. Revered in memory, the deceased have no duties to perform, no imperative to follow, no deeds to which they may be praised or blamed. With stark candor, the psalmist declares, "The dead praise not the Lord, neither any that go down in silence." The Jewish reality principle places a limit on mourning. Maimonides warns against excessive mourning. He who frets over the way of the world is foolish. I do not understand the afterlife literally or vertically. Literally means an afterlife, or vertically means up there, right? Gan Eden, paradise, or Gehenna, hell, for me, do not refer to another place, another world, another time. The Mourner's Kaddish refers to none of these. It speaks of the mobilization of human energies to sanctify God's name here and now in our time. Despite the rich rabbinic literature and daily prayers that speak of calling the dead to eternal life and refer to a celestial Garden of Eden, in practice, that afterlife does not appear to function as a major Jewish belief. Eulogies for the individual or consolations for the martyred victims of the Holocaust rarely, if ever, call upon the resurrection of the dead or the disposition of the soul in heaven as an explanation or comfort. The yearning for another world I understand as a protest against the wretched status of the status quo. I believe in the immortality of influence, there you go, that testifies to the ideals of the deceased and calls upon the living to keep faith with the noblest aspirations of those who sleep in the dust. So the most fitting tribute is neither a statue nor naming a bridge for him, but to read his words and take them to heart and understand from within what it was he asked of us and to go out and to do it, to live a life of godliness. I wonder if you'd rise for me so that we might recite Kaddish together. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah v'yalmad divrach irutei v'yamlich malchutei B'chai echon of yom echon of chayei dechal Beit Yisrael, ba'galau v'zman kariv yimru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam u'me'ol maya, yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitalev v'yithalal shemei dekudsha b'richu, le'elam min kol birchata v'shirata, tush b'chata v'nechamata, Damiran be'alma v'yimru amen. Yehei shlama Rabbah min Shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav, hu yaseh shalom. V'al kol Yisrael v'yimru. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to share a few questions between us, and then we know that questions. Arnie asked me a question, which I'd be glad to lead with, and then anyone who'd like to ask a question. I will do my very best to channel Rabbi Schulweis and answer the questions. I was actually listening to him this afternoon on a tape he did of a lecture in 1998 on this very topic. Now, the lecture is 45 minutes long, and only 2 people got to ask him questions. So I'll try not to do that. But we'll try to answer your questions. So I want to begin by asking my colleague, Rabbi Farkas, this question. I'm a rabbi of the 20th century. You're a rabbi of the 21st century. Your career will be of the 21st century, and your students, God willing, will go beyond you into the 22nd century.
Maybe.
Rabbi Schulweis was taught by Mordechai Kaplan, who was born in the 19th century, right? So the question really is this, is these ideas, predicate theology, the God within, conscience as the sign of revelation, what of these ideas still work for Jews of your generation and will work for the Jews of the next generation?
Good evening, everyone. It's good to see everyone. Happy Hanukkah. Rabbi Schulweis, I think, we were just having a sidebar conversation about prophets, and one of the ways that you know a prophet is a prophet according to Jewish tradition is if they say what's going to happen in the future indeed comes true. Taka, he's a prophet, right? That's the idea. He predicted so much of the intellectual flow and feeling of the Jewish community. Many of his ideas, I think, are still really relevant. Ideas like that Jews come from a certain place, a certain religious place, but they have a global responsibility. Young people today, more than ever, feel like they're not just born into a community, a family, let's say, in our case, a Jewish family, but a human family. And that their Jewishness is a way that animates their humanness. If I can even use that as a word. That Judaism animates their humanity in a way that draws them into the world and not out of the world. Rabbi Schulweis was very clear about that, especially in some of the last phases of his work, that conscience, global responsibility, a call for justice is in itself sacred because it does exactly that. It draws you into the world and not out of the world. I think that is probably his greatest gift to the next generation. I think that his understanding of pluralism, his understanding that either or questions lead you into idolatry on both sides, and that true religious philosophy, religious ways of being in the world are in the middle, on this pendulum that constantly swings back and forth, and rather looking at the either or, you look at this soft middle, and that is a way of engaging, I think, hearts and minds to think about what religion can be for the world. So those are 2 ideas, I think, at least that are really profitable.
It seems to me that there's been a pendulum swing in the religious life of the community. When I was young, these ideas about predicate theology, a God behaved, were very, very resonant. They worked a lot. They worked well for a generation of people raised with survivors, for example, who were still wounded from the Holocaust. It seems to me it's somewhere in the 1990s, the community began to move the other direction, and now there's a tremendous emphasis on a transcendent God, a God I can talk to, a God I can experience, and instead of a cerebral religious life, a head religious life, a real experiential religious life, an emotional religious life. How will that play in the next generation?
Well, I think you're right about that too, and there is an interplay between Schulweis's teacher Kaplan and your teacher Abraham Joshua Heschel. Kaplan was about this cerebral understanding of the culture and that how the culture itself can iterate religion. And Heschel was very much focused on how the phenomenon of religious experience can shape the reality, the religious reality in which we operate. For example, the beginning of the Holocaust happened 40 years before I was born. That means that if you had your bar mitzvah at the beginning of the Holocaust, you're already 53, 54 years old before I was even born. And by the time I came to my bar mitzvah, that means that you were going to be 66, 67. So the Holocaust for me, as a way of looking at Judaism, was something that was in my DNA, but it was a fading memory from the moment I was born. Because I didn't have a way of relating to it. And it became part of history. I barely knew survivors in a deep way, in a way that I know that your generation experienced it. I was never around for the emergence of the State of Israel. The 67 war, which animated the imagination of the American Jewish community more than any other, happened 13 years before I was born. And now I'm a father with 4 kids, so you understand how, and I mean that to say that you understand how history has progressed. When you really take a view of the snapshot of what Judaism means, there's a different reality that's happening on the ground. So part of that is then the cerebral escape from the pain of the Holocaust, for example. It was something that existed in many, many, many of the Jewish theologians, including Rabbi Schulweis. But folks of my generation come at it from a different place.
Yeah. I once asked him, I once said to him, it seems to me, this was in the 90s, that the question that your generation asked was a question that his generation never had to ask, which is, why be Jewish?
That's right.
For him, it was in his DNA. It was a question of how to be Jewish. But your generation was already faced with a much wider range of identity choices. And the question of why be Jewish was something that he never addressed in his, either the Rabbi Kaplan for that matter, they didn't address it. So I asked him once, I said, so if a kid asked you, why be Jewish? What would you say? And he looked at me and said, why not? And I said, no, not good enough. No, he said, I meant it. Why not? He said, look, at all the treasures of this tradition of what it makes you, of the kind of person it makes you, why wouldn't you want to be part of this? And I think that was connected as well with his notion of, whenever people would ask him in conferences, Rabbi, tell us about the current state of the synagogue or the rabbinate. He would always say, don't ask what the synagogue is, ask what it ought to be. That we're supposed to create an environment in which no one would choose anything else. You resonate with that as well?
Absolutely, because I think that when I work with younger people, not only do they not eat babka, they don't eat gefilte fish, right? They don't eat any of these gastronomic things. They love Indian food. They go out for Indian. And not only do they go out for Indian, they want to go to the most, quote-unquote, authentic Indian food that they can find. Right? The one where no gringos are sitting inside the restaurant.
You got to know, by the way, that we are raising a generation of young people who think that sushi is necessary for a Jewish simcha.
So
right?
true.
You have a bar mitzvah for a wedding and they don't serve sushi, it's treif. So this is...
No, seriously, right? And you're also raising a generation of people, and I'm sure you understand this, where younger folks, when they get married, they don't just want to celebrate with Jewish traditions. They want to write their own vows. They want to experience it not necessarily in a synagogue. In fact, they'd love to experience it outside or at a hotel. The party might have an ode to some religiosity to it in the sense that they might do a 15-minute hora or simcha dance where they bring out a chair, but really what they want to do is they want to experience itself. In fact, there's a newer trend where not only are they not wanting to marry inside a Jewish institution or even related to a Jewish institution, many younger people I've talked to, in fact, tomorrow morning, I'm having a meeting with a couple that's questioning whether a rabbi at all needs to marry them, and they'd rather have their friends marry them than have a rabbi marry them.
Oy.
But this is
time to retire.
So this is, I think, where we're challenged. Is it's not about for those who can't believe or for those who won't believe. It's for those who don't even know what the word believe means.
Right.
And where I looked at the Chanukiah tonight, right? And I see we're halfway through. And you can look at that Chanukiah as half lit or half yet to be lit.
Oh, very good.
Right? No, seriously though, right? I see opportunity. I I see challenges. I see lots of challenges. I'm dedicating my whole life, the next, God willing, 40 years of my life to this, right? But I see lots of opportunity in a way to move beyond the quote-unquote reconstruction, as Rabbi Schulweis started laying out in the 20th century, and starting to see sort of an entirely new project that might not look or feel exactly like it does today, that it will have to be shaped to the nape of understanding, of human understanding, of Jewish understanding in the next 100 years. But we have to figure out a way to do it in a way that still feels indigenous to who we are. And to me, that's the challenge.
Right.
And it's not necessarily a theological challenge, because I'm not even sure that theological language is the language that will move us forward. And it's not a cerebral challenge, it's an emotional challenge. It's a quest for authenticity, a quest for meaning, as you've written a number of times, a sense of bringing out of our own individualism into the world. Mm-hmm. And those are going to be our challenges.
Good. Arnie had a question. Why don't you start? You want to start?
I raised the question of the predicate theology and how do you rationalize then coming back into the synagogue and using the prayer book? That certainly is totally inconsistent with the predicate theology.
Very good. So the question is, I'll just repeat it so we can get it on tape. The question is, having posited predicate theology, how did the rabbi come back and use the prayer book in the synagogue? Given the fact that the prayer book, all of the images and all the language, almost all the images language of the prayer book, reflect what we call more conventional or a subject theology, a God up there, okay? And it's a question I asked him too. It was a very interesting conversation that we had. You know, Mordechai Kaplan, his teacher, rewrote the prayer book. When Kaplan created Reconstructionism in the 1930s, one of the first projects, he had a synagogue called the SAJ, the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, on the west side of Manhattan, and Kaplan rewrote the prayer book because he wanted to have a prayer book that reflected things Jews could believe. And when I got to the SAJ in the 1970s, I was a teacher there. The rabbi that was there threw out Kaplan's prayer book and brought back an Orthodox prayer book. And I said, what did you do that for? He said, because the Orthodox prayer book has in it all of the images of the tradition that we need to explore, Schulweis said to me, it's always a question of how you read a text. The process of Judaism is not to throw out the texts that were, but to read them and to offer commentary on the text. You ever look at a Talmud page, there's a column of Talmud and many columns of commentary. That structure is a structure of thought. Here's the way we used to think. Here's one generation's ideas. Here's another generation's ideas. Here's another generation's ideas. And the conversation among those columns of commentary is what makes up what we call Torah. Torah is not the book, not the scroll. Torah is not the book lying dead on the table. Torah is the argument conversation that we have over the book. So for Rabbi Schulweis, he said, I'll keep the prayer book, but I'm going to discuss with the congregation what it means. Right? You may have noticed, because this is our style of doing services. Some of you have been here on the holidays specifically. You know, when you'll have one prayer and 30 minutes of commentary on the prayer. And you're looking at your watch wondering, well, why did it just take us 2.5 hours to do 4 pages in the Machzor? Because it takes you that much time to articulate what this can mean, what it really means, how it can be constructed to mean that. And that process of commentary is what he recommended. He was very, very disturbed when the conservative movement came out with prayer books and didn't have any commentary on the page. Because he said, that's what makes it interesting. That's the intellectual life of the Jewish people, is the conversation. So when we did a prayer book here for ourselves, we put lots and lots of commentary on the thing. And I told him the way I'm going to do this is I'm not going to print it hardcover. I'm going to do it softcover so that we can continually renew the commentary. And that brought him a lot of pleasure because it meant that the commentary was always a growing entity. It was an ongoing conversation among Jews about what it is that we deeply believe. That's how he would do it. So he would read the text as it was, and then enjoy his own sort of conversation about it, as you converse. And it was impossible, by the way, to get any davening on that bima done with him, because as soon as you sat down, he had something he wanted to talk about. And I, there was the joy of sitting next to him for 25 years, was the joy of that sort of running commentary for 25 years, God's still waiting for me to finish a service, because it's just, and we do it now, and we get yelled at all the time. The cantors tell us to shut up because they want to pray, but we want to talk because that's what shul is for. It's that conversation. That's how I think he would understand the prayer book. Does that?
You're so unique
What?
with regard to other conservative and reform congregations in that you do that. Others don't.
Too bad.
He did sing beautifully, by the way.
He not only did he sing
Right?
beautifully, he prayed
He
beautifully.
davened.
He davened,
Right.
And I once asked him that. I was ticked, and I said, so I was like, how come you daven like a chassid and you teach like a litvak? Because he did. When he prayed, it was beautiful how
That's
he prayed.
right.
He davened
so-
like a litvak. He davened like his grandfather, but he learned like a litvak. It was just so frustrating. Douglas.
When you were teaching, you used the phrase uncompromising imperative,
Yeah,
which sounds to me like an absolute.
it is.
How do you get pluralism in there? And I know the rabbi was a proponent of pluralism.
Well, I mean, I would say that the pluralism comes in the application of the thing, right? I'm trying to contrast two different kinds of moral rules. There's a moral rule that I hold for myself, but I break it either occasionally or more than occasionally. I don't know how many of you have ever been on a diet, but you have the diet until the babka comes along, and then you say, all right, I'll diet tomorrow, right? The moral rule is I'm going to drive carefully unless I'm in a hurry, right? The moral rule is I'm going to speak softly to my family until I get angry. And then there are some moral rules that I never break. There are moral rules which are so central to my conscience and to my consciousness that I'll destroy myself before I'll break this rule, right? And these are moral rules that I call moral imperatives or uncompromising imperatives. And what I was suggesting, I'm trying to answer this question, which is a question I'm not satisfied with the rabbi's answer, so I'm trying to construct a better answer, which is, what's the difference between calling something good and calling something godly? He gave his answers in his book. He gave his answers in his lecture. I think there's a better answer. And I think the difference is that good is something like a diet that I might compromise, but godly I don't compromise. And the example that I gave, I think, is an apt one, and Janice is here as my witness to this. What does Harold Schulweis, born in the Bronx, living in Los Angeles, Jewish rabbi, have to do with black Africans in Darfur or Africans in the Congo? I understand his obsession with Christian rescuers of the Holocaust. That's our story. But in what way do Africans in Darfur have any role whatever to play in our narrative? And the answer is that if you see genocide as an evil and it is godly to end genocide, then you're going to look across the world and and this becomes your task. This becomes your need. This becomes something you can't let go of. And he couldn't let go of this. And so that's what I'm calling godly in his life. And so what we're looking for are those imperatives which are godly, which are the ones that are, that we don't let go of. So Rabbi Farkas here, my dear friend, would hold that it is godly to house the homeless. Now, remember what Rabbi Shoei said, where do you understand godliness from? From the experience of your people. We are a people who know too well from the inside of our experience what homelessness is like. We have a long history of exile. Somebody's singing, right? So the response is housing the homeless is godly, and Rabbi Farkas has gone out to become a hero for this. And was it today or yesterday? Met with the mayor, is fighting with the government to obtain the funds and the power in order to house 40,000 homeless people in Los Angeles. And Now, again, I'll give you a clue. Most of them aren't Jewish. They don't live in Encino. But because we identify that as a community, as a godly imperative, we're going to make sure that we have that we invest ourselves in this to an uncompromising extent, to an unreasonable extent. And that's what I'm calling, that's my interpretation of his notion of godliness, okay? So that's the Feinstein gloss on the Schulweis Chiddush, okay? You want to ask?
Further follow, Rabbi Farkas talked about being born after the Civil War, that Israel has been established. My question has to do with your generation and an understanding of history. How much, when you encounter young people, do you think they don't get history, or they don't study history? I know when I look at what my kids study for history, you know, like my jaw usually drops, because, you know, whatever they're studying seems to me to be a bunch of dreck. And, you know, so the question of, like, when you
All right, let me pose the question. So the question is, when young people study history, you know, what do they know of history and how do they view history? Did you want to?
I can't speak to the curriculum that your particular children, Doug, and you know, I also find that that for those of us who are not in my generation, you know, as people view us, right? They it's sort of like driving on the freeway. Anyone who drives faster than you is a maniac, and anyone who drives slower than you is an idiot. So you have to be careful about when you say your generation and what their view of history is, and then you preface that by saying my kids learn Drek. It's sort of like saying that, you know, as long as they learn what you want them to learn, Doug, then they're driving at the right speed. I don't know that. I can't speak to that. What I can speak about is a sense of history in general. History still motivates a lot of young people. To discount the young people, the millennials, the Gen Y folks, of which I'm like the oldest of that generation, and to say that they don't know history, I think is incorrect. I think where they don't know enough is the same way that they don't know enough about Judaism. And the reason they don't know enough about Judaism is because many parents didn't invest in them the rhythm of Jewish life beyond sending them to Hebrew school or day school or camp. They didn't bring their kids to shul. They didn't invest with them in Shabbat dinner. There are plenty who did, and I don't want to discount those who did. But the question of exposure has to do as much with the responsibility of parents as it does with kids. The college level conversation, which has to do with what they're teaching in college, that again, I have not much to say about that because it's been a while since I've been in college, but I have no control over that. That's nothing that we can really focus on. But I do think that, for example, Rabbi Feinstein and I have an imperative that before these kids go, every minute you put them in front of us is an opportunity that we can help. But it can't be up to us alone.
I'll give you just one. My son got me this for a Hanukkah present.
It's a nice
This
watch.
is a knockoff Apple Watch. Now, it has the time and the temperature and the date, and when my phone rings, my watch rings, and it reads on here what it says. This didn't exist 3 years ago. I mean, you're raising a generation of kids who are living in a world that is changing at such a fast pace that technology has changed the rhythm and the style of human communications, that technology is changing their exposure to the world. The world is changing at such a pace. And so I get where kids are living in that kind of a fast-paced, changing universe, much faster than the world you and I grew up in, and much, much faster than the world, say, Rabbi Schulweis grew up in, that they're pointing forward and not backwards. And they have little patience for what was. They have little patience for what was. I will give you, however, my sense of your anguish, because I hear you. So there are a couple of now political leaders who will go nameless in this synagogue, because of course we never make political comments, who have cited the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War as a positive precedent for how they would proceed with policy going forward for others. Now that, I would say, is a gargantuan failure of a society to learn from its own history. And the fact that the first time it was done, people said, "Oh my God, can you believe this guy is?" And the second time it was done, it became, and it's now become more regular. So that, I agree with you in that sense.
Can I add one piece?
Yeah, I want to go on with another question.
Yeah,
Go
just
ahead.
to summarize sort of where we're at as a world. If you really think about it, kids who are now driving today has never known the United States not being engaged in active armed conflict somewhere in the world. Kids who are driving cars today, young people that I work with in our Hebrew school and in our Teen Tuesday program, have never known a world without deployment of active military personnel.
They were born after 9/11,
They were born after 9/11.
right?
That is the world we live in, right? Whether we are an eternal, unending Orwellian warfare.
15 years old. 15, yeah. Okay,
Right.
questions. Let's get to my pop, yeah. Briefly.
Heschel spoke of a personal God,
Yeah,
a who,
yeah.
and Kaplan spoke of a communal God, of when. And Rabbi Artson says you need both. And Rabbi Gilman said you have to make a mythology that makes you comfortable and gives you the truth. How does that fit in with Rabbi Schulwitz's philosophy?
Oh, that's a good question. All right, so
Learned a
so
lot.
you've seen now a variety of Jewish theological constructions, right? You've heard Rabbi Artson's sense of what he called process theology, Rabbi Gilman's sense of mythology and how myth works, right? We talked about Rabbi Heschel's experience of God, right? And now you have another one with Rabbi Schulweis, a different kind. Now, Rabbi Schulweis, in conversation with all of these guys, kept arguing that these are not exclusive of each other. That there's a place for that there are many ways in which these things pull together. I think that Rabbi Schulweis's answer would be, whatever you're going to say God is, what difference does it make in the way that you conduct your life?
That's right.
That to him is the bottom line question. What difference does it make in the way that you walk the world, see other people, vote, act in the world? What sense of imperative fills you as you live in the world? And frankly, if you find Rabbi Gilman's mythology, myth-making, or Rabbi Artson's process theology, or even Rabbi Heschel's sense of ecstasy, of religious experience, compelling, that's fine. But the real question is, what difference does it make in the ethics that you live? I mean, he kept saying that the proof of God's existence is in our behavior. It's verified by behavior. So the concept to him, it wasn't as important. The metaphysics were not as important as how it comes down to the way that people behaved. It's really a sense of the creation of an ethical personality, and an ethical community support that personality. Okay?
It's a lot easier with like you was alive.
No. Malka, please.
But there's one other element that was very significant for him. You alluded to the increase of the I,
Right.
and one of the ways in which he stayed in touch with the other was to encourage them to react
Mm-hmm.
to something.
Yeah.
He wanted to stay in touch, otherwise he didn't know what was effective and what was not effective.
Mm-hmm.
So that
Yeah, I will. Yeah.
So the increase of there's I, there's thou, there's we,
Right.
but the role of the I
Mhm.
in all this is magnified in the modern world, in the contemporary world,
Right.
especially among our children and grandchildren.
Right.
We want to watch to see there's no excess, of course, but we want to give them a way to let us know what's important and what is not, what is useful, what is not,
Right.
what worries them.
Yeah.
Gives them a sense of sanctity.
Rabbi Schulweis, one of his other teachers was Martin Buber. In fact, he studied Buber for his master's thesis at NYU, and he wrote the first English language master's thesis on Martin Buber. Buber, of course, had this idea that what's real in life is the conversation, is the connection. that the connection, the intimate connection of I and thou, of two human beings who share a life together, is what makes human life meaningful, what makes it worth living. So, Malka's suggestion is that modernity has stressed the individual, the I. What Rabbi Schulweis did, both in his philosophy, but even more in his philosophy, in his modus operandi, in his way of working with people in the community, was always to engage us in conversation, always to ask, what do you think? Always to ask us to respond, always to ask us for questions, always to engage in dialogue. Because in dialogue, something happens to us. We open up to another person, and in the conversation, we grow. In that meaning, we grow. And that was one of his concerns. One of the concerns was that modernity continues to shrink the world down to me and mine. And the need for a religious community to open us and remind us that we're connected. Did I get this right? Remind us that we're connected to other people, and that in the connections we're going to grow. That it's not about simply satisfying my own needs, but it's satisfying my needs to be connected to another human being. He wrote a very, very interesting, he gave a very, very interesting sermon, which became very important. It was this sermon in which he introduced the idea of para-rabbinics. And he introduced a character that he called the psychological Jew. And by the psychological Jew, he anticipated a great deal of research that was going to come out in the 1980s and then again in the 2000s, where he basically said there's this person who comes to shul. They don't want to belong to a community. They simply want the commodities that the community is offering. You know, put my kid through Hebrew school, give me the bar mitzvah. And he pointed out that what happens is you end up with this psychological Jew who doesn't want to join the community, who doesn't want to meet other people, who doesn't want to engage in conversation, who doesn't want to grow, who just wants it for himself. And if he had the opportunity, he would have private religion. Private religion means I want a bar mitzvah and I just want my own friends there. I don't want the community there. Right? I want my rabbi. The private religion. And Schulweis said private religion is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction because religion, at least Judaism for him, is an opening of the self to the other, an opening into conversation. Now, what was prescient about it, was prophetic about it, is he wrote this sermon in 1971. Okay? In 1982, a professor at Berkeley named Robert Bellah, very famous sociologist of religion, comes out with a major study of American religion called Habits of the Heart. And he introduces an idea called the sovereign self, which is exactly what Rabbi Schulweis was talking about, the psychological Jew. It's the person who's afraid to engage in relationships, because if I engage you in a relationship, it comes with a claim on me. And I don't want to be claimed. I want my options open. I want my options open, right? I remember a young man who came to see me because he was in love with a girl and he wants to marry her and he's not sure. And I said, what are you not sure about? I said, do you love the girl? I love her, Rabbi, I love her. So you think you can have a nice life together? I'm sure we can have a nice life. So why don't you marry her? He says, what if another one comes along who's better?
That's right.
Translation, I don't want to give up my options.
You think
You
he's
know,
joking,
people-
but he's clearly... I'm sorry for interrupting. He is describing...
His generation.
He's describing my brother. I mean, it's like... He's describing an entire generation of people who are afraid of commitment in a really deep sense, afraid of commitment because they have to see the tragedy that choice, the strength of choice brings to the sovereign self. That when you choose one thing, you are by necessarily philosophically choosing not another thing.
Which diminishes you.
That's right. You slay one choice.
Which diminishes you. You've lost the freedom, right? It's the matrimonial equivalent to leasing a car. You know, every 3 years you can turn the wife back in and get another one, a newer one with lower mileage and a nicer trunk, you know, so...
It's the family who says, "I'll marry you because I'm pot committed. We've been in this relationship long enough."
See, so the thing, and so the Jewish tradition teaches this opposite idea, which is, you won't know yourself until you're deeply into a relationship, which is I thou, right? And that's what Rabbi Schulweis. What Malka's pointing out is, you remember how he would teach Torah from the Bima, and he would always stop and say, "Okay, comments, questions." he meant that. He wanted us to engage in that conversation. Sometimes, it went on for hours and hours. It went till Tuesday, but he meant it because that's where Torah is. It's in the conversation. Okay? Marty, yeah.
No, I was just wondering if young people don't want to choose Judaism because it's exclusive, and they don't want to make that announcement that I'm Jewish with the understanding that means I don't understand anybody else, and it's like in that Lennon song where it'll
Yeah.
be perfect when everybody,
Imagine there's no religion, right?
there's no religion.
Yeah, who was it? Was it, I think, the Dalai Lama who once said, when a kid comes to me and says, I'm a Buddhist, he says he was a Buddhist. And when a kid comes and says I was a Muslim, I'm a Muslim. When a kid says I'm a Christian, I'm a Christian. And when a kid comes and says I'm a humanist, I'm a universalist, I embraced all religions, that kid was a Jew, Right? I think the Dalai Lama actually said that, So it's exactly right. There's a sense of not wanting to stake my claim on a faith, to put myself in a place and identify in a particular way. And that's one of the great, because the problem is if you don't, in the same way of the kid who refuses to commit to his partner, you'll never have a significant relationship. Bobby.
You said a phrase a few minutes before, earlier, an ethical person in an ethical community. Would you discuss that? Can you be an ethical person without the community? You were implying you need the community.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think you can be an ethical person in an immoral world, but it's really hard. Those people are heroic. Ethics, morals, a sense of goodness, a sense of obligation, a sense of responsibility is cultivated. Maimonides said that character traits are habitual. You teach a child to be generous by helping that child give charity. Helping that child give charity, by the third time you give charity, charity becomes part of the child's character. Ethics, morals are habitual, they're part of our lives, and where we live in a community in which they are celebrated, it gives us the strength to go on being that way. It's very, very difficult to live an ethical life in an unethical world. It's one of the midrashim on why it was that at Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham stops at 10. Why doesn't he go down to 1? Why does he say if you find one good man in that city, support the city? And the rabbi's midrash is because there's no such thing. Because if you're the only ethical person in the whole town, pretty soon you'll begin making compromises and you'll get swallowed up into the immorality of that place. It takes a community of people to support the ethical personality so that a person has the strength internally to say no to what is brutal in their society and say yes to what is good, and that's why you create a community. You want a community where these things are talked about. Look, here in the synagogue, I have a class. Rabbi Farkas helps me with this class. We have a class of 11th and 12th graders. I mean, the most wonderful kids. You go around the table. They go to the highest powered schools in this city. They have the highest grade averages. These are kids applying to some of the most prestigious colleges in the world, in the country. And that's wonderful. And our job is to teach them one last time before they leave that there's more to life than that. That there are deeper levels of being. Nothing wrong with going to that college, God willing. And I write them recommendation letters, good ones. But I also want them to know that the quality of their relationships, the sense of mission they have in the world, the causes they embrace, the things that they do outside of their academic life, that's also something to be celebrated. A successful life isn't that one page of your resume that lists all the colleges you went to and all the awards you won. On the other side of your resume, it ought to have the significant relationships you've cultivated, the causes you've sacrificed and worked for, the beauty that you've brought into the world, the things that you do to celebrate God's creation. That's also part of your resume. And we may be the last people the kid ever hears that from. They're not going to hear it from their college counselors, and they're not going to hear it from their parents, right? Because the parents are like, go to Yale, Rabbi Feinstein says, yeah, go to Yale, but take music classes, Right. Go to Yale and breathe, well, not New Haven, but go to Yale and look at the stars. I mean, just somebody's got to say to the kid, You're a full human being. So this is, you want to give the kid a sense, a community is there to teach people, to fill in the gaps in their moral education that the culture leaves out. Yes, please.
Yes. You're talking about a generational difference between Rabbi Marcus and yourself, Rabbi. And it seems to me that one of the big challenges that he faces that you have not had in the past, but are facing now, is the digital age in terms of isolationism, in terms of people, and your services Friday, I read the quote in there about how little time parents and kids spend together.
Yeah.
How much time kids spend on their iPhones, whatever. Does Judaism have a big problem with the evolving technology and the sense of isolationism that occurs?
Yeah. You should answer this, not me. My generation's finished. You answer this one.
The question was about digital isolationism.
I grew up
and,
with punch cards. Anybody here remember punch cards? There you go. There you go. This is talking about my
I have
generation.
no
as the Who
idea what
once
you're
said.
talking about.
You wouldn't even know what punch cards are.
The question was about digital isolation. I want to just add one quick piece to
Fortran.
that. I also want to say it's not just younger folks who feel isolated or experience isolation. I do want to say that our oldest generation, we have a community in America that isolates our elderly, and that we also have to be thinking about isolation of the elderly as their friends and family pass away or move away. When I think about isolation, I don't just think about the younger people. I think about our oldest people too. It's true, but we've had a time memorial way of literally ensuring that people can move out of their phones and into communal space, and that is the observance of the Sabbath. One of the greatest, newest, coolest things out there is to have what's called a day of unplugging, written by a bunch of religious Jews, reformulated as a national day of unplugging when everyone puts their phones away for 24 hours. It's amazingly new. What's old is new again, right? And so the way that I think about it is that we have to find a way, and I have friends who are working on this, that use digital technology to encourage Jewish life. So we actually engage them through phones and through games on your phone and through pictures and apps and things like that. But when it comes to digital isolationism, the best thing that I can say, and I say this to every mommy and me class that we have, is while the candles are burning, you should treat that 15 minutes, half hour as a special time. You should put the phone away and just spend that time with your kids. And then I ask our dads, because I'm really concerned about this. I ask our dads, what would it be like if you negotiated with your boss to come home early on Friday afternoon? What would it be like for you to take that chance and to say, I'm going to come home early. I'll make up the time some other way, but I'm going to come home early on Friday afternoon because this time is sacred to me. And I challenge our dads around that. And they feel very challenged when I ask them that. But I challenge them around that and say, if you all asked it together, if you all made that ask, and says, if your quality of life and your quality of work go up because you feel like you're actually achieving that work-life balance, because you're willing to unplug, you're willing to be more present, then I challenge them to do that because I think they'll be more successful.
Can he achieve it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Ron?
I think I understand Rabbi Schulweis's interpretation, but I don't understand the role of prayer or who you pray to in that scheme.
Good. That's a very good question. So the question is, if you take Rabbi Schulweis's notion of predicate theology, then what's the nature of prayer? Who do you pray to? Okay? What does prayer mean? What's the experience of prayer? Okay? So he writes about this in his book, For Those Who Can't Believe, and he's spoken about it many times here in the synagogue. In fact, one of the last Yom Kippur sermons he gave was on that very question. I think, in short, he would say the following. if you understand that that there is a godliness within us, that is, each of us has a capacity for self-transcendence, for doing things beyond our own interests, beyond our own desires, things that are meaningful to us because they express the very best in us. When one prays, one doesn't pray up, but one prays within. One reaffirms that that is there. One strengthens that sense of oneself. One contemplates where I ought to engage my energies, and one renews it. I express this in my work when I'm talking to kids specifically. And I said to kids, you're going to go out into the world and meet evil. And it's going to break your heart. It's absolutely going to break your heart. You may go out with all, because I remember my own generation of people who had great ideals. We were going to change the world, revolutionize the world, bring peace to the world. And so many people of my generation went out into the world and they met evil. They met its broken, the world's brokenness, its limitations, and they met their own limitations. And they became deeply and bitterly disillusioned. And instead of pursuing tikkun, fixing the world, they gave it up, became very selfish people. Or they gave it up and found refuge in drugs and drink. Or they gave it up and found refuge in consumer kinds of things and just buying and buying and buying and buying. You know? And I think the mistake there is that you need a retreat from the world. Once you've met the world's evil, you need a retreat, a place to come back to regain a sense of your resolution, to regain a sense of your courage, to regain a sense that I can do this. I mean, here's Janice, and I keep pointing to you, and I apologize, but you're the poster child for this. So Janice, who is the chairman of Jewish World Watch, has made many trips to the Congo. If there ever was hell on earth, it's called the Congo. 7 million people destroyed in a civil war. 7 million people. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of women raped as a political act, not out of mishigas, but purposely in order to destroy family structures. I mean, if there ever was hell on earth, you know, and we send these people from Jewish World Watch to go and to witness it. You come back, if you came back and said to me, to hell with this, I'm never doing this again, I'm going back to the practice of law, or I'm just going to live as a nice Encino housewife and forget it, you would have every right to do that. But having witnessed hell, where do you go to regain a sense of my own ideals and my own capacity to make some difference? That's what prayer is. We don't pray, dear God, fix the world for us, umain. You pray, said the rabbi, you don't pray for ends, you pray for means. You say, dear God, give me back the wisdom and the resolution and the courage and the energy and the strength to go back out there and do it again. And do it again. And that prayer for means is a prayer that God always answers. It's a prayer that God, look, one of my closest friends is an oncologist. I happen to know a lot of oncologists, unfortunately. Oncologists, you go into oncology because you're the smartest kid in every school you ever went to. My friend was the smartest kid in elementary, junior high, high school, top of his class in college, top of his class in medical school, 3 years of internal medicine, 5 years of a fellowship, and 2 years of a postdoc. And the poor guy was 37 years old before he ever earned a paycheck. And you know what? On day one, he knows he's going to lose half of his patients. So where does he go to maintain his idealism and his faith that at least for the ones he can cure, he's worth fighting for? And even if today I can't cure the disease, tomorrow I can cure the disease. He needs a place to come to where someone is going to say to him, let's pray, let's gain the strength, let's renew our idealism, let's gather in our courage so you can go back out there and heal. And that's what prayer is. It's the renewal of it's a renewal of nefesh. It's refuat nefesh. It's the renewal of soul. It's the renewal of soul. That's what prayer is. And if it's done right, that's what it does. That's what it does. Meditation is one element of prayer. Meditation is an element of prayer. Communal singing is an element of prayer. Recitation of words of Torah is an element of prayer. But its purpose is not to bring down godly powers. Its purpose is to find the godly powers we all have hidden inside of us and to renew them after the world has beaten us down. I'd like to ask Malka to finish our conversation tonight. I'm going to bring you the microphone, if that's okay. Wait. I'm sorry. I'm cursed.
He was very insistent on this phrase, nature takes its own course. So that it was terrible for him if you prayed for something that ran against nature. If one had a terrible illness, you prayed for the strength of the physician. You prayed for research. You prayed for morale to give to the family. But you never prayed for the resurrection of the dead in any way. Whatever, never allowed prayer that went against nature. And he was tested with one of his own children.
Right. And he believed in something called Adonai, which he defined as the self-transcendent capacity of human beings to heal what is sick, to rebuild what is broken, right? And that he believed in. That's what he called God. That was Adonai for him. That was God.
It had to eventuate in something that could be done, not always by a single person, by a self, most often in concert with a community of like-minded people. But it had to be something that you prayed only for what could be accomplished.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.